Hello there and welcome back. So in this video what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the container that we just modeled and we're going to be filling it up with the little Fruit Bites candies for our final illustration. And in order to do that we're going to be using dynamics. We're going to be using the Modo dynamic system. But before doing that we need to make some dynamic elements. So first off, let's open our scene. So you can open up the candy package or the package scene. For me, I'm going to be opening up in Content Video 12. We're going to be opening Package 02 on that, and that contains our package that we surfaced in the last video. So we can do a little bit of house cleaning here, so we can just turn off those texture locators, so it might be distracting. I'm going to take these three elements and group those together into the packaging. And I don't think we need our backdrop anymore, so I'm just going to delete that backdrop element. So previously we made this collision object, and I think I've changed my mind about whether or not we're going to end up using that. So I think what we're going to do is we're just going to delete that item. It wasn't fully modeled for our purposes. I think just using the base package as is going to work just fine for us. So let's make that collision object now. So control copy all of those polygons from the base layer. And then we're going to go up here and hit new, create a new mesh layer, and we're going to hit V and paste those in to our layer. Make sure these are all turned off here. Those are all happy. Okay, so this is just going to be our collision object now. And then we'll give that a material, collision. Just leave those at the defaults, just something that's a little bit easier to see. So let's go in and we want to freeze this geometry. So I'm just going to freeze that at the default levels. And I'm also going to triangulate that just so that we have all triangles. So it's going to make a nice, all the polygons will be guaranteed planar. So we have a nice clean collision object for that. So now we're going to hit in again, and we're going to make our little candy bit. Turn these guys off here really quick. So this is just going to be the cube tool in the basic toolbox. So we just click and drag. We hold down control, it'll constrain that. So I want to make sure that it's centered. So I got our gang edits and hit 0 on that, and then we want our size to be 190 millimeters by 45 millimeters by 190 millimeters, and then we want to give that a segments of 4, 1, and 4. So if we look at that, this is what our little candy bit looks like. So that is all we need to do for that. Hit Shift Tab to make that a subdivision surface object. And let's assign a quick material to this. Fruit bit. And we'll just give this a color. Make mine red. Alright, so far we've made a collision object and we've made this little fruit bite element here. Bit on that. So the next thing we need to do is we can start testing out some of the dynamics. So dynamics is going to be working at the item level, no longer in the components level. So we'll be jumping in here to items mode, and then we'll start working on our items. So I'm just going to take this and move this above our container, our collision object here. And now to assign some dynamics to this, we're going to want to jump into our setup layout. So if you're using the layout switcher, that's Control Tab, and we're going to jump into setup, and you might have your schematic workplace visible here. You can just sort of minimize that. We don't really need it in this particular case, so we can maximize using these little arrows here. It just gives us a little bit more screen real estate there. So on the toolbox on the left hand side, we want to select down here to dynamics. This is the little dynamics sub tab, and this gives us all of our options for setting up dynamic elements. And really it's just a case where you're going to select an element and then you're going to click the button to assign that to that dynamic setting to the element. So for our collision object, this is not going to be moving at all. It's not going to be deforming. So what we want to do here is we want to do this static rigid body. So static means it doesn't move. Rigid meaning it's not going to be deforming in any way. And you can see, if I deselect everything, it has added this little dynamic sub-tab here to our properties form. So we're just going to accept the defaults on that. Now our little fruit bit element here, now this thing is going to be moving during the simulation. We want it to be affected by gravity and by the forces. So that is going to be an active rigid body. So with the item selected, we click on the active rigid body. So now we have two dynamic elements, but in order to see them move, we need to create a simulation. So, and the simulation buttons here are these three little green buttons down here. Basically what the difference is between all of these is these first two on the left are the runtime simulations. These are just going to give you an idea of what it looks like in the viewport. It's not going to be actually creating a renderable simulation. So the left one, what it does is it plays whatever the settings are at your point in time. So if you're at frame 82 and you have something animated a certain way to be in a certain position, that's the value that it's just going to take as the initial starting point. If you are doing something that has things moving around, you'll want to use the second button. That's going to be the animation that's going to actually play the timeline in a loop. So whatever the length of your timeline is, it's going to sit there and loop through your timeline while it simulates the dynamics. For our case, we can just use this left button here. And then the last button, what that does is that basically saves your simulation into the scene, so that makes it then a renderable element. Of course, it's using higher quality calculations than the real runtime buttons here. So you'll always want to make sure to do a final simulation on that in order to see that the settings are working out for like what you want. But for our purposes, we can just use this button here. So we'll see the first problem here is the fact that our element isn't going into our cannon. That is a collision problem. So we can select our element, go to that Dynamics sub-tab now, and we're going to change our collision shape to the mesh. And what that's going to do is that's going to use this actual mesh shape for colliding our objects together. So now we'll do another simulation here. So it looks like our element now can drop into our container. We can do a quick little simulation here. Just the first 100 frames. And then we can select our fruit bit and see what's going on. So okay, so now we have the problem of there's an awful lot of space in between these two elements. So we want to reduce this margin of collision between the objects. So I think we're going to go in here to our dynamics again, and we're going to change our margin from 40 millimeters to 2 millimeters. So for the size of our object, that's really going to be small, and you don't really want to make that margin 0 because that's going to be the area where the dynamic simulation is going to be judging when things are colliding or not. It can't be constantly doing collisions, so it always wants to calculate those collisions within those margin areas, those margin volumes that are generated. So we can try that simulation once again. Select our fruit bite here, and it looks like that we've no longer having that issue of the elements crowding. Alright, so the next thing we want to do, we have one of these successfully falling in here. So what we really want to do now is we want to have a whole bunch of these guys. So I think what we're going to do with that is we're going to move this guy again, kind of get him arranged over the top of our container, and then we're going to clone a bunch of these guys over the top of our container, and then just allow them to fall in to the container. So why don't we jump in and save our scene here really quick. So we're going to go into Content, Video 13. I'm going to save this as Package 03. Just overwrite it so you can see exactly what it is that I'm working on here. So now we want to create the clones of this element. So we're going to do that in the modeling toolbox. So as a shortcut here, we can just open up the modeling toolbox with this little button, go to our duplicate, and I want to use a replica array because that's going to give me some flexibility in the way that I create the array. So basically what this does is automatically generates a replicator and sets up your point source and your objects. So if I click on the replica array button, I want to have a count of 4 on the X, 4 on the Z, and I think I want to have 30 on Y. So if I click in the viewport, we actually want these over the top of the container. So I think if I switch to the top view here, we can get a little bit of flexibility in making sure that those all end up centered over the top of the container. Go back to our perspective view. And now we also want to make sure that they're spread out enough that when we do our random rotations on these guys, if we just simulate them all flat like this falling in, they're just going to end up stacked like pancakes, and it's not going to be very interesting when they fall into the container. So we want to add some variation on that, but we need to give them enough space to make sure that they can do that variation. And I think that gives us enough space. So now we have a great many of objects in here. And now what we want to do is we want to select that replicator item that was generated here. And then we're going to add some randomness to that. So we're going to go into the variation option with the replicator selected. And then I want to go to the random twist here, and I'm going to set the gang edit and just set that to 360. So it will randomly rotate any of these elements. Got my zoom length upset. So now what it's going to do is it's just going to randomly rotate any of these little bit elements so that they're not going to end up being all the same stacked on top of each other. And actually we can sort of further edit that by selecting the vertices of this. And I want to rotate this point cloud. So get the rotate tool with the E key, and then we're going to activate a fall off. So we can jump into our model tab because we don't have a fall off control in that layout. We're just going to get a fall off linear, and then we're going to have that set as linear. And then you can see we can just rotate this 90 degrees there. It just gives us a little twist so the objects don't end up being stacked. We're just trying to create some random sort of variations on all of these elements now so that we're creating our clones. So now the last thing we need to do is we need to make these into elements that we can simulate. So in their current state, if we were to simulate, nothing is going to happen to these because this is just a replicator. And what I want to do is I want to go in then and I want to go to Item, Replicator, and I want to freeze that replicator. And what that basically does is it removes the replicator and it just replaces it with instances. So now each one of these little elements here is its own item. We can select each one of these. And since they are instances from our original object, they're going to take the dynamic setting that we had originally set up on our object. So we can actually copy that into the folder here. So we have our little fruit bits all together here. And then now we're going to jump back into setup, layout here, and then we can do a little quick simulation, kind of see what that's going to look like. Of course, now that we have so many elements, it's going to be going quite a bit slower. So that looks like it's mostly getting all of our objects in our container. So I'm going to stop that and do the real simulation. So let's do that real simulation. We might need a little bit of extra time, so I'm going to give that the end time frame 200. And I'm just going to click OK. So now it's going to take Modo a minute or two to do this. I will actually pause this so you don't need to watch it all the way through, and we'll see what our simulation looks like. So it's just about to finish here. It actually has not been bad. It took about 3 minutes to do that little simulation, but now we can grab the timeline and actually play this out. So it seems as though our container is overflowing with little fruit bites now. But one of the things we can do that we've run a simulation now on our elements is we can hide this collision object. And we can see that they're not packed very tightly. So we should have enough elements to fill up the entire container, but since they're sort of all stopping at all these weird angles, it's not giving us quite enough. And I think that has to do with some of the physical properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these elements and adjust their physical properties all at the same time. So I can do that just by double clicking at the top of the folder. Then I can control click just to deselect that top folder element. So now I can go into dynamics. And I think I want to adjust these bounce and friction settings. So it took a little experimenting for me to find the one that made me happy. But I think one that's going to get you the best results is we're going to reduce the bounce to 5. So that's just the amount that the amount of energy that's going to be transferred between elements when they collide. And then the friction is just how much they slide against each other. And I think that just gives you a nicer sort of stack. So I'm going to reduce the friction to 25 on that. So Control Escape to drop that selection. And we're going to turn back on our collision object. I'm just going to hit Control S there to save our scene, because we are mostly happy with where we are right now. And I'm going to run another simulation here. So click OK, and we'll be back in just a second. Alright, that seems to have finished now. Another few minutes have passed. So let's look at that. See, the problem we're having now is they're all starting to fall through the container. So while they're probably stacking better, if we look back here, closer to frame 180, yeah, we're getting a really nice stacking result now, much more compact. But when the energy comes down of the weight of all of those elements on there, it's pushing them through the bottom of our collision object. So there's two things we can do to increase the accuracy of our collision. One is to increase the thickness of this collision element, because what's happening is when an object passes through it, it just doesn't even realize that it's passed through since it's so thin. So I'm just going to go through here, and this is just going to be quick and dirty. So I just selected a few of those elements. Alright, I think that's good enough. Just select those polygons there. I'm going to go into Model. We're going to deform and push. I'm just going to push those elements outward. It's just going to thicken up our collision object. Control Escape on that. And then I'm also going to increase the accuracy of the simulation. So if I select the solver, minimize the replicator elements, this physics rate in here, this basically defines how often it checks for collisions during the course of things moving around. So if we increase this physics rate to a higher number, it's going to do more calculations to find if things are penetrating through other objects. So I think if we increase this times 4 to 480, that's going to give us a more accurate simulation. But keep in mind that increasing that value generates more calculations. So we're basically going to take 4 times longer to do our simulation. So with that in mind, let's jump back here, and we're going to do one more simulation of the same end time here. And again, I'll pause and be back. Alright, so now our simulation has calculated, and it definitely did take 4 times as long for that. Let's take a look at that. It seems as though we're still losing quite a bit of them. But I think we're filling up enough. that it doesn't really quite matter. Let's hide that collision object. Yeah, I really like the way that they're stacking now. Got a nice random feel to it. So I think what might be happening is some of these elements here are overlapping now. So the initial force that dynamics applies to it to repel objects from overlapping is causing them to fly out a little bit. So we could probably create a funnel that would force those objects down in there really quick. But I think for our purposes right now, we're just going to stick with the simulation that we have here. We have all of these elements down here. Is that quite full enough once we put the actual lid on there? Let's look at the real packaging turned on. We can open up a preview really quick. You know what, I think I'm going to try and do the funnel bit here just to save us a little bit of time. So turn off that packaging, and I'm just going to create a new object. I think I'm going to model a quick cone here. So we'll just do some real-time problem solving. So we want to be in component mode here. Make our cone. And I think we're going to have this centered on X and Z. Doesn't have to be terribly complex. Then we're going to delete this guy. We will delete the bottom portion of the cone. Maybe one more. Delete. Now I'm going to use the thicken command to thicken that out some. I'm going to triangulate this whole element. Call this funnel. And for this, we're going to select this one, again in items mode, and this is going to be a static rigid body. So I think we can just live with whatever the defaults are on that object. Might need to move it up a little bit. Okay, now let's go back to our first frame and try one more simulation. See if this is going to really fill that thing up. Alrighty, so we're back now, and we have a much better simulation this time. We're losing far fewer pieces than we were. And I have to say that there was one error made when we created the funnel. I actually needed to go into the dynamics of the funnel and set the collision shape to mesh in order to make the little candy bites fall through the funnel itself and resimulate that again. But now we have a good simulation on this, so we can hide the funnel, hide the collision shape, and see that we got a really nice packing that we're getting in there. It looks like it's very random, but they're fairly close together. So I think the next thing that we want to do is we want to freeze all this because we just want these things to stay within our container. So what we need to do is go to the frame of the simulation that we want, and we can select all of those elements. So again, double click on the folder and then control click on the folder itself. So with these elements selected like that, then we can just go into Dynamics and then Bake Dynamic Transforms. So you can see now, as I move that timeline, they're not jumping back up. They've just inherited that value. So what we can do at this point is delete out our solver. And I'm going to save this scene as 3B so that just you have a reference scene that has the dynamics in it that you can take a look at if you so desire to. So we have a few of these elements down here. So now that we've frozen this, we can just go into items mode here. And then we can just delete these elements that didn't quite make it. And then some of these objects here are also going to be penetrating the package. So we want to get any of these that would be hanging over the edge of our collision object. And we'll be wanting to delete these elements as well. So these won't matter quite so much because they'd be up in the lid. But we don't want any elements there really floating. So just select those and delete them. So we can turn on our real packaging here. Looks like this one might be penetrating as well. So nothing else sticking full, and we have a very full looking container here now. So since we've saved this as a separate version, I think we can also delete our little collision objects. Are no longer necessary. And we don't need the point cloud element. So we basically have all of the fruit bits themselves. So I will rename that. And then we've frozen the simulation, and we can open up a preview here really quick. All right, so I think that gives us a fairly clean scene that has our little candy bites inside of it. So I think next up in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to be doing the surfacing for our little candy bites. But in summary for this video, basically we started out by modeling our little fruit bit element, and then we assigned dynamics to that, and we did the simulation of the dynamics. And then we cloned our object, and then by adjusting a few of the dynamic properties, we were able to get a nice stacking inside of our package, giving us a very realistic result. So next up, we will be doing the surfacing for our candy and tweaking the surfacing for our package to get a little bit more realistic result.